The letter wasn't a promise. It was a dare. It arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in a scrap of linen that felt like it had been through a war, carried by a mail rider who looked the same. The dust of 1,000 miles was ground into its fibers. Eliza Granger didn't have much, but she had trembling hands, and that's what she used to unfold the paper. She read it by the weak, flickering light of a single tallow lantern. The flame danced, and her breath hitched right along with it. The handwriting wasn't script. It was a collection of angry scratches, like someone had tried to carve their will into the very soul of the paper. The letter came from a place with a name like a threat. Devil's Throat, Wyoming Territory. It was signed by a man named Matthew Klenn. His words were stripped bare of poetry. There were no sweet nothings, no talk of a life of ease, no lies about beauty or gentle kindness. He wrote like he was stacking stones. I have land and I am alone. If you come, I will keep you warm, and I won't raise my hand in anger. I've seen what harm a man can do. I want peace. If you do too, write back. Eliza had known men who promised heaven and delivered hell. She'd met them in back alleys and fine parlors. Her own body was a map of their promises, a rib that clicked when she breathed too deep, a gap in her smile where a tooth used to be, a network of faint silvery scars on her back that whispered stories of fists and boots, and nights where the only sound was her own fear. Surviving wasn't something to be proud of. It was just a thing that happened, or it didn't. And right now, it felt like it was about to stop happening. The boarding house she called a home was collapsing in on itself, slow and quiet. Merritt, the old woman who owned it, the one who let Eliza stay for laundry work and a promise to not make a fuss, was dying. Her life was seeping out of her, one rattling cough at a time. For weeks, Eliza kept Matthew's letter tucked under a loose floorboard beneath her cot, a secret and a poison. But then one night, Mart coughed a spray of bright red blood into a gray rag, and Eliza saw the look in her eyes. It was the look of a door swinging shut for the last time. Her choices were gone. She pulled out a greasy scrap of butcher paper, the kind used to wrap salt pork, and dipped a pen in watery ink. Her words were as blunt as his. I am not pretty, and I am not young. I can clean, sew, and mend. I won't be struck again. If you drink, I won't come. I have nothing but my name, and I aim to keep it. If you still want me, I'll come on the 4th train in May. She didn't have a picture of herself, and even if she did, she wouldn't have sent it. Let him see the truth of her when she arrived. Let him see the mileage on her face and decide then. Merritt didn't make it to spring. The old woman died in her sleep, leaving Eliza utterly alone in the decaying house. She buried her with the help of 2 strangers from the livery, men who didn't ask questions and accepted a worn silver dollar for their trouble. She didn't say a prayer or a eulogy over the plain pine box. What words were there for a life lived and then unlived? She just went back to the empty house and scrubbed the walls of the room where the old woman had slept, trying to wash away the scent of death. The train ride west was a special kind of misery. It was a long, bitter journey in a freight car with 3 other women. They were all running from something. You could see it in their eyes. A haunted, hunted look. They huddled together for warmth, but never spoke of the ghosts that chased them. Eliza kept her small canvas bag on her lap, her thin coat pulled tight around her shoulders, and her heart locked up so tight she could barely feel it beat. When the conductor finally bellowed the name of her stop, Devil's Throat! The word echoed like a curse. She stepped down from the train onto a platform that looked like it had been carved from wind and punishment. The station was just a shack. The town was a handful of leaning buildings. For a long moment, she thought she was completely alone. And then she saw him, Matthew Klenn. He was taller than she'd imagined, with skin burned the color of old leather by a relentless sun. His eyes were the gray of a stormy sky, and they were steady. They didn't flicker or shy away. They just watched. His hands resting at his sides looked like they were made of rope and iron, thick and calloused and scarred. He wasn't a handsome man. He wasn't an ugly one. He was just there, a fact of the landscape. He tipped his hat, a single curt gesture. You made it, he said. That was all. No smile, no handshake, no welcome. Just those 3 words dropped between them like stones into a deep river. The ride to his ranch felt like it took a lifetime. The buckboard rattled and groaned over an earth that was cracked and hard as bone. Dust was a living thing out here. It coated her tongue, filled her lungs, and seeped in through every crack in her worn boots. His land was vast and raw, a place that didn't seem to want people on it. The fences sagged like tired old men. The barn looked like it had been shot and was still deciding whether or not to fall down. A thin black dog with ribs showing trailed them, its head low, its eyes nervous. It looked like it was expecting a kick at any moment. When they finally pulled up to a small, grim-looking wooden house, Matthew gestured with his chin. "This is it," he said, his voice flat. "I won't pretend it's much." The house didn't look like much. It looked like it had survived something terrible and was tired of telling the story. Inside, it was even more bare. A single table, 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove. On a small shelf, a worn Bible sat next to a neatly folded blanket. That was it. He showed her to a small room off the main one. It was empty except for a narrow cot, but it was clean. She set her bag down on the floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the crushing silence. It felt like she was planting a flag on a hostile, alien world. That night, they didn't speak. They didn't touch. She didn't even take off her boots, sleeping fully dressed on top of the thin mattress, one hand resting on the hilt of the small knife she kept tucked in her belt. She was a guest in a stranger's house, in a stranger's life, and she wasn't about to make herself vulnerable. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The silence was the first thing she had to learn. It wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy, full of things unsaid. In the days that followed, Eliza threw herself into work. It was the only thing she knew, the only thing that felt real. She scrubbed the floors until the wood grain showed. She stitched new curtains out of old flour sacks, patching the holes with careful, tiny stitches. She found the leaks in the roof and plugged them with mud and grass. She boiled every drop of water from the well twice before she'd even think of drinking it. Matthew just let her be. He moved around her like a ghost, his presence a constant, silent weight. He worked his land from sunup to sundown, his shoulders bent to the plow, his face a mask of concentration. He never offered to help her, and she never asked him to. It was a strange, unspoken truce. They were 2 separate countries sharing a border, and neither was willing to make the first move. The dog, who Matthew called Jonah, was his shadow. It followed him everywhere, a sad, silent companion. Whenever Eliza looked at the dog, it would look away, its weary eyes full of a history she couldn't read. She suspected the dog and the man had a lot in common. One afternoon, while sweeping under his cot, her broom hit something solid. She knelt down and pulled it out. It was a bottle of cheap whiskey, half empty. Her heart seized in her chest, a cold fist of fear squeezing the air from her lungs. "If you drink, I won't come," she had written. The words mocked her. She held the bottle in her hands, the amber liquid sloshing inside. She thought about smashing it against the wall, about confronting him, about packing her bag and walking until she collapsed. But she did none of those things. She just slid the bottle back under the cot, exactly where she had found it. She would wait. She would watch. The next morning she swept under the cot again. The bottle was gone. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. But something shifted between them after that. A tiny seed of trust had been planted in the barren soil of their arrangement. Slowly, piece by piece, she started to learn him, not through words, but through observation. She saw the long, puckered scar that ran down his left arm, from his shoulder to his wrist. She noticed that he spoke more to his horses in a day than he had spoken to her in a week, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Every night, he would light a single candle and place it on a crate in the hall between their 2 rooms, a small beacon in the oppressive darkness. But he never, ever crossed the threshold into her space. After a month had passed, a month of shared silence and shared work, she finally broke. She found him out by the fence line, mending a broken post. "Why did you send for me?" she asked, her voice rusty from disuse. He didn't look up from his work, his hands twisting the wire with practiced ease. "Because I was alone," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "And I know what that does to a man." She didn't reply. but the simple, brutal honesty of his answer settled deep inside her. He wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for a witness, someone to prove he still existed. But even with that small understanding, the fear clung to her like a shroud. Old habits died hard. A quick movement would make her flinch. A shadow in the corner of her eye would make her brace for a blow that never came. Every night she still wedged a chair under the handle of her bedroom door, a silent testament to the ghost she couldn't shake. Matthew never asked her why. He never questioned the chair, or her flinching, or the haunted look that sometimes crossed her face. He just waited. He gave her silence when silence was the kindest thing he could offer. And in that quiet, patient waiting, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't love. It was something far more fragile, far more precious. It was the beginning of trust. Then one evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a single sound split the air. A gunshot. It was sharp, loud, and impossibly close. Eliza dropped the wooden pail she was carrying, the water splashing cold over her worn boots. Her breath caught in her throat, stolen away by the sudden violence of the sound. Before the echo had even faded, Matthew was moving. He seemed to materialize out of thin air, a rifle already in his grip, his body coiled like a snake ready to strike. His gray eyes were fixed on the ridge to the north, a hard, calculating look on his face. Jonah, the dog, was growling, a low, guttural sound deep in his chest, his body pressed flat to the ground. Matthew glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice a low whip crack. "Stay low." She didn't argue. She scrambled into the house, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she didn't hide. She went to the small kitchen window, peering through the grimy glass. She watched him stride toward the barn, not running, but moving with a calm, deliberate purpose that was more terrifying than any panic. He moved like a man who knew violence, who had shaken its hand and looked it in the eye. This wasn't a farmer responding to a stray shot. This was a soldier going to war. Inside the dim house, her own body went into a familiar, chilling routine. She lit a lamp but kept the wick turned down low, just enough to cast flickering shadows. She took the sharpest knife from the kitchen drawer and placed it on the table, next to a tin of flour. She forced her hands to be steady, her breathing to be even. She had been in this place before, a place of waiting and fear, and she knew how to survive it. When Matthew finally returned, his face was a dark storm cloud. The sun had set, and the night had fallen fast and hard. "Not meant for us," he said, but his voice was tight, betraying a doubt that his words tried to hide. Maybe poachers, maybe travelers who lost their way. Eliza didn't believe him for a second, and the look in his eyes told her that he didn't believe himself either. That night she didn't sleep. The gunshot was a symptom, not the disease. It was a harbinger. Something from the past, a dark, crawling thing, was coming for them. And the fragile piece she had just started to build was about to be shattered into a million pieces. 2 days passed. The silence that fell over the ranch was different now. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of anticipation. The air itself felt thick, like you could bend it. The wind, which was a constant presence in Devil's Throat, seemed to whisper warnings as it dragged grit across the wooden porch. Jonah the dog became a second skin for Matthew. He refused to leave his side, a low growl perpetually rumbling in his chest. Eliza tried to go about her chores to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She washed clothes, her knuckles raw from the harsh soap. She boiled water, watching the steam curl into the air like a ghost. She sewed patches onto Matthew's work shirts, her needle moving in and out, a small, repetitive motion in a world that felt like it was about to spin out of control. But her ears were always straining, listening for any sound that was out of place, for the crunch of a boot on gravel, for the whinny of a strange horse. She was hanging laundry on the line, the wet clothes flapping in the relentless wind, when she saw them. At first she thought they were just shadows, tricks of the light, but as she squinted, her heart began to pound a slow, heavy drum beat. They were boot tracks, wide, deep impressions in the hard-packed earth. 3 sets of them, at least, and they were fresh, far too fresh to have been from before the gunshot. These men had been here recently. They had been close. She didn't call out. She walked calmly back to the barn where Matthew was shoeing one of the horses. She waited until he was done, until he had dropped the horse's hoof and straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow. Then she just said, "You should see this." He followed her back to the clothesline. He crouched down, his movements fluid and economical. He touched the edge of one of the prints with 2 fingers, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't need to study it for long. "You recognize them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his eyes still fixed on the tracks. "But I know the kind of men who walk like this. They're heavy on their feet. They're used to hurting something." That night, the pretense of normalcy was gone. Matthew didn't bother with chores after supper. He just took his rifle and sat on the edge of the porch, his back against a post, his eyes scanning the darkness. The rifle lay across his knees, comfortable and familiar, like an extension of his own body. He didn't ask Eliza to join him, but after a while she brought him a steaming mug of coffee anyway. She handed it to him, and their fingers brushed for a brief second. It was the first time they had ever touched. She sat down on the top step, a few feet away from him. For an hour, maybe more, they just sat there in the dark. The only sounds were the far-off, mournful cry of coyotes and the soft guttering of the lamp flame inside the house. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was a shared vigil. At last his voice came out of the darkness, low and rough, like stones grinding together. "There was a time I was like them," he said. Eliza didn't move. She didn't even breathe. She just listened. "Not with women," he added quickly, as if that was the most important distinction in the world. "But I was angry, all the time, drunk mostly, always looking for a fight. The war, it took parts of me, parts I still can't find or name." He took a long sip of the coffee, the mug warming his scarred hands. He stared out into the impenetrable blackness, but Eliza knew he wasn't seeing the night. He was seeing the past. "I killed a man once," he said, the words dropping into the quiet like stones into a well. "Not in the war. After." Eliza didn't ask him why. She didn't ask who the man was or what he had done. She didn't need to. In that moment, she understood something profound about Matthew Clinton. He was a man who had walked through hell and had somehow, miraculously, found his way out. "I think I understand," she said softly. And she did. The quiet that fell between them then was different. It wasn't empty, and it wasn't heavy. It was full. It was the quiet of 2 people who had looked into the abyss and recognized a fellow survivor. They were listening to the same terrible truth, a truth that neither of them ever wanted to speak aloud. The next morning, the truth came riding down the valley. It came in the form of 3 men on horseback. They thundered into view, their horses kicking up clouds of dust, their faces hard and unsmiling under the brims of their hats. They were bearded, grimy, with dust caked onto their jackets and malice in their eyes. They didn't ride straight for the house. Instead, they circled the fence line, slow and deliberate, like wolves testing a wound, looking for a weakness. Eliza stood at the kitchen window, the flour sack curtain clutched in her hand. Her back was ramrod straight. She didn't call for Matthew. She wanted to see them for herself. She wanted to know what kind of men they were. One of them, a younger man with a red bandana tied around his neck, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the ground and pointed a lazy finger toward the dilapidated barn. The oldest of the 3, a man with cold, dead eyes, laughed a short, ugly bark of a laugh. Matthew stepped out onto the porch. He didn't rush. He moved with that same unnerving calm she had seen the night of the gunshot. The rifle was held loosely at his side, almost casual, but his knuckles were white. His voice, when he spoke, was firm and carried easily on the wind. "Can I help you, boys?" The one in the red bandana spoke first, his voice a mocking drawl. "Just looking for a friend. Heard he might have passed this way." Matthew shook his head, his face impassive. "Ain't seen nobody but the wind and my own horse." The older one, the one with the dead eyes, urged his horse a few steps closer. He leaned forward in his saddle, his gaze fixed on the house. "That your wife I see peeking from behind the curtain?" Eliza froze. Her blood ran cold. She let the curtain fall from her numb fingers, plunging the kitchen into shadow. "That's my business," Matthew said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its neighborly tone and gaining a hard, dangerous edge. "You boys best ride on." For a long, stretched-out moment, nobody moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Jonah's low growl rumbled from under the porch, a promise of violence. Then the older man straightened up. A mocking grin split his face. He tipped his hat in a gesture that was pure insolence. "Well, mister," he said, his voice full of false charm, "we'll be seeing you again. Real soon." They turned their horses and rode away, not fast, but slow, defiant. They left their tracks wide and obvious in the dirt, a clear and deliberate scar on the land. A promise. Inside, Matthew found Eliza standing by the table, her hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles were white. "You know them?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. "Not by name," Matthew said, his eyes dark. "But I know the type." "Were they lying?" "Oh, yes," he said, without a moment's hesitation. "They were lying." A knot of ice formed in Eliza's stomach. Her throat closed up. She stared at the floor, at the familiar patterns in the wood, trying to ground herself. It wasn't working. "They were looking for me," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Matthew didn't say anything for a long moment. He just pulled out one of the chairs and sat down, the wood creaking under his weight. He looked at her, his gray eyes steady, patient. "You want to tell me why?" Her story came out in ragged, broken pieces. The words were rough, unwilling, but the truth clawed its way out of her, desperate for air. "I left a man back in Missouri," she began. "He wasn't my husband. Not truly. But he owned everything. The mill, the general store, the sheriff. He owned the whole town. He owned me." She paused, swallowing hard. "He claimed I stole from him. Claimed a lot of things. I just ran. I didn't look back." Matthew's eyes never left her face. They were full of a quiet intensity. "What did you take from him, Eliza?" She finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Her own eyes were fierce, defiant. "Only myself." For the first time, he reached across the small table. He didn't say a word. He just covered her hand with his. His grip wasn't rough or demanding. It was warm, sure, and completely unshaking. It was the hand of a man who had made a decision. "I won't let him take you again," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow. And for the first time in her entire miserable life, when a man said something like that to her, Eliza Granger actually believed him. The next day, the ranch transformed. It ceased to be a home and became a fortress. They didn't talk about it. They just worked, a silent, efficient team. They set brutal, homemade traps along the fence line, concealed pits and tripwires armed with sharpened stakes. Matthew, using an axe, dug sight lines through the dense brush, creating clear fields of fire from the house and the barn. He showed her where he had buried a second rifle, wrapped in oilcloth, behind the woodshed. "Just in case," was all he said. Eliza took the old revolver Matthew kept in a drawer and practiced with it until her wrist ached and her ears rang. She loaded and reloaded, fired at empty cans set on a fence post. Her hands steady, her eyes narrowed. They were no longer waiting to be victims. They were preparing for war. They didn't have to wait long. The men came back. They came in the dead of night, under the cloak of a moonless sky. The attack started not with a gunshot, but with a roar. The barn went up in flames. The fire caught fast, the old dry wood crackling like 1,000 screaming voices. The horses trapped inside shrieked in terror. Jonah bolted out from under the porch, a black streak of fury, barking wildly into the inferno. Matthew moved like he was part of the night, a shadow with teeth. He was shirtless, barefoot, the rifle already in his hand. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just moved, a blur of deadly purpose. Eliza was already on the porch, her own rifle pressed tight against her shoulder. And then she saw them. 3 shapes silhouetted against the raging fire on the ridge. 2 on horseback and 1 on foot, holding a lantern aloft. The man on foot was laughing, his head thrown back, his silhouette a twisted caricature of joy, as their livelihood turned to ash. Eliza didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She acted. She lined up the sights on the laughing man and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The shot rang out, sharp and clean. The man on foot dropped the lantern as if it had burned him, and it shattered on the rocks. He dove for the cover of a tree. One of the riders, startled by the shot, lost control of his horse. The animal reared, and the man tumbled from the saddle, landing hard. The third man fired back, his shot wild. A bullet whined past Eliza's head, splintering the wood of the porch post right next to her cheek. She ducked, ejected the spent shell, and rammed another one home. She rose, resighted, and fired again. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Matthew dragging the panicked horses out of the burning barn, their eyes wide with terror as smoke billowed around them. Jonah was a whirlwind of rage, circling and snapping at the edges of the chaos. Eliza's hands were already beginning to blister from the heat of the rifle barrel, but her aim stayed true. She saw the older man, the one with the dead eyes, the one who had been in the saddle. He had remounted. He was lining up a shot, not at her, but at Matthew's exposed back. There was no time to shout a warning. There was no time for anything but action. Without thinking, without feeling, she swiveled, found him in her sights, and pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the sudden quiet. The man jerked in the saddle, a strange puppet-like motion, and then slumped forward, sliding slowly, gracelessly to the ground. Everything went still. The only sounds were the hiss and crackle of the dying fire and the terrified screaming of the horses. The fight was over. The two remaining men, one limping, scrambled into the darkness of the hills and vanished. One man lay dead in the dirt, a dark stain spreading beneath him. Eliza stared at the body. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, but her hands, still holding the hot rifle, did not shake. She had just taken a human life, and all she felt was the cool night air in her lungs and the profound, deafening silence of survival. That night they sat at the small kitchen table, their faces and clothes black with soot. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had happened. Outside, the last embers of the barn collapsed into a pile of glowing ash. At dawn, Matthew took a shovel and went out to where the body lay. He dug a shallow grave and rolled the man into it. He said no words, offered no prayers. He just filled the hole. Then he did something strange. He took the dead man's hat from the ground and tied it to a fence post. A grim, silent warning. "Practical," he said when he came back inside. "Not cruel." "They'll come back," Eliza said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Matthew answered. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw the promise in his eyes. It wasn't fear she saw. It was a bone-deep, unshakable resolve. They had drawn a line in the dirt, and they would die before they let anyone cross it. The next day, a new message came. It was nailed to the wooden stake above the well. It wasn't a letter. It was a statement, pinned down with the severed, bloody wing of a hawk. The writing was crude, almost childish, scrawled in charcoal. Eliza pulled it free and read it aloud, her voice steady and cold. "She's ours. You know it. She stole blood. We'll come to collect. There's more of us than bullets in your house. You should have let her go." There was no name, just a crude mark carved into the bottom of the paper, a shape like a spade. Matthew took the note from her hand and walked to the stove. He crumpled it up and tossed it into the firebox without a word, watching until it was nothing but black ash. That night, Eliza found him sitting out by the new makeshift fence line, just staring out at the dark, silent hills. The dead man's hat fluttered in the breeze a few yards away. "You should sleep," she said, coming to stand beside him. "They won't stop," he answered, his voice a low rumble. "No," she agreed, "they won't." He turned his head to look at her, his face half in shadow. "They'll regret not stopping." She sat down on the ground beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. The night was cold, but she didn't feel it. "You don't have to protect me, Matthew." He turned his whole body toward her then, his expression serious in the faint starlight. "I'm not protecting you, Eliza. I'm standing beside you." And that was when she reached out and took his hand. His fingers were rough and calloused, but they closed around hers, strong and sure. He didn't let go. "Wait, before we move on, what do you think is going to happen next? Do Eliza and Matthew stand a chance against a whole gang? Let me know your predictions in the comments below. I'm really curious to see what you guys think. The air grew colder with each passing sunrise. It felt like the land itself was holding its breath, bracing for the violence that was sure to come. The ranch was no longer a place of peace. It was a stronghold. Eliza and Matthew worked tirelessly, driven by a silent, shared purpose. They rebuilt the porch, but this time they used thicker logs and reinforced the supports. They lined the inside of the windowsills with flat stones and packed clay, creating crude but effective bulwarks. They took the fence posts that weren't burned and sharpened their ends into wicked-looking stakes, turning their perimeter into a jagged, unwelcoming smile. The ranch looked less like a home now, and more like a fort that had already seen battle and was expecting more. They never spoke of their fear, but it was a constant, unspoken third presence in the house. They both knew the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. One morning, Matthew saddled his horse. He checked his rifle, stuffed some jerky and a canteen into his saddlebags, and turned to Eliza. "I'm riding into town," he said. It wasn't a request for permission. It was a statement of fact. She didn't ask him why he was going or when he would be back. She just nodded. For 4 days she was alone. Alone with the silence, the wind, and the ghosts. She had Jonah for company, and the 2 rifles were never far from her reach. She patrolled the property every morning and every evening, her eyes scanning the horizon, her ears tuned to the slightest sound. She was not the same woman who had stepped off the train months ago. That woman was gone, burned away in the fire of the barn. On the evening of the 4th day he returned. He rode in slowly, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. There was a fresh, raw bullet crease across his left shoulder, a red line of violence that he hadn't had when he left. In his hand, he held a crumpled, torn piece of paper. It was a bounty poster. He smoothed it out on the table. The drawing was crude, but the name was clear. The man she had shot, the man Matthew had buried, had brothers. 5 of them. They were part of a vicious, bloodthirsty crew that called themselves the KD Gang. They were known for raiding homesteads, stealing livestock, and worse, much worse. Matthew said nothing about what else he had done in town, how he had gotten the wound on his shoulder, or where he had gotten the poster. But his eyes were harder when he came back, colder. The war had found him again. That night, for the first time, Eliza went to him. She crossed the hall, the candle in the hallway, flickering and casting long, dancing shadows. She went into his room and stood by his cot. He looked up at her, his face a mask of exhaustion and pain. She leaned down and kissed him. It wasn't a soft kiss. It wasn't sweet. It was a kiss of desperation and defiance, the kiss of a woman who had chosen her ground and the man she would stand it with. He kissed her back the same way, his lips chapped, his breath tasting of coffee and dust. It wasn't a kiss of love. It was a pact, sealed in the darkness, a promise of shared survival. Weeks passed. An uneasy, nerve-wracking quiet settled over the ranch. Every sunrise felt like a reprieve. Every sunset a threat. Then one evening, as she was feeding the chickens, she saw it. A thin plume of smoke, rising from the ridge to the east. It was too close to be a homesteader's cook fire. Matthew was out in the far pasture, mending a section of fence that was too far away for her to call him. She didn't panic. She calmly finished feeding the animals, locked Jonah inside the house, and checked the loads in both rifles. Then, carrying one of them, she began to walk toward the smoke, moving silently through the trees, using the terrain for cover. She found them by a small campfire. 2 boys, neither of them old enough to grow a proper beard. They were skinning a rabbit, their knives flashing in the firelight. It was their conversation that turned her blood to ice. "She'll come looking," one of them said, a skinny kid with shifty eyes. "Boss says she's got a soft spot. That's how we'll get her." The other one, heavier set, laughed. "All women are soft," he grunted. "That's why they break so easy." Eliza stepped out from behind the trees, the rifle leveled at her shoulder, the muzzle pointed right between the boys' eyes. They froze, their faces a comical mask of shock and terror. The skinny one made a move, his hand darting for the pistol tucked into his belt. Eliza didn't even aim at him. She fired a single shot into the dirt right by his boots, sending dust and pebbles flying. He yelped and snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. "Go west," Eliza said, her voice low and dangerously calm. "Walk until your boots rot off your feet. If I ever see your faces again, I won't miss." The boys scrambled to their feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush like spooked deer. They didn't look back. She took their rabbit and buried it herself. That night, she told Matthew what had happened. He clenched his jaw so hard she could see the muscles bulge. But all he said was, "They're circling. They're testing us, finding our soft edges." She looked him straight in the eye. "We don't have any," she replied. But they both knew that wasn't true. They had one soft edge. They had each other. The gang came again, this time under the cover of a storm. The rain came down in sheets, and the wind howled. A perfect cover for an attack. There were 5 of them this time. The first man hit one of the tripwires. His scream was cut short as a sharpened stake drove up through his leg, pinning him to the ground. The others didn't stop. They spread out, using the storm as cover, their torches sputtering but still burning, casting eerie, dancing shadows. One of the torches arced through the air and landed on the porch roof. The flames took hold immediately, clawing at the rain-soaked walls. The final battle had begun. Eliza fired from the west window, Matthew from a barricaded position in the root cellar. Jonah, who had been hit by a stray piece of shrapnel in the first firefight and had a limp to show for it, snarled and barked, moving between the rooms, a fierce, 4-legged sentinel. The back door burst open with a splintering crash. A man filled the doorway. He was a giant, with fists like sledgehammers and a crude spade tattoo on the side of his neck. He grinned when he saw her, a terrible, triumphant grin. "I told you I'd come for what you stole," he growled. It was him, the man from Missouri. He lunged, knocking the rifle from her hands with a single brutal swipe. The gun clattered across the floor out of reach. She didn't scream. She grabbed the heavy kitchen knife from the table, the one she had set out that first night. But he was too fast. He grabbed her wrist, twisting her arm behind her back with excruciating force. "I should have chained you to the floor when I had the chance, you thieving whore," he hissed in her ear, his breath hot and foul. In that moment, something inside Eliza snapped. All the fear, all the pain, all the years of being beaten and broken, it all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of pure rage. She slammed her head backward into his face. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. He howled in pain, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all she needed. She twisted free, brought the knife around and drove it into his side, just below the ribs. He roared, a sound of pure animal fury, and swung at her. She ducked under his arm and drove the knife into him again, and again, and again. She didn't stop until his strength finally broke, until the light went out of his eyes and he collapsed to the floor in a heap, the wood running slick and dark with his blood. When Matthew finally reached her, crashing up from the cellar, the fight was already over. The house was quiet once more, save for the sound of the rain and Eliza's own ragged breathing. The KD gang was broken, its members either dead or fled into the storm. By morning, the rain had stopped. Together, Matthew and Eliza dragged the bodies out into the yard and burned them. No markers, no words, just ash for the wind to carry away. Days passed. The air, which had smelled of smoke and blood, began to smell clean again. The land began to heal, and so did Eliza. She washed the floors of the house until they gleamed. She washed the soot and blood from her skin, scrubbing until she was raw. She washed her hair in rainwater she collected in a barrel, letting the water run clear. One afternoon, she stepped out barefoot onto the rebuilt porch and looked out at the hills. For the first time, she didn't see threats hiding in the shadows. She just saw the land, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the fear was finally gone. It hadn't just faded away. She had killed it. Matthew came to stand beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. "You did what I couldn't," he said softly, looking at the place where the bodies had burned. "You faced it." "I did what had to be done," she answered. The seasons turned. Spring came again, and with it, new life. Green shoots pushed their way up through the dead grass. The ranch was stronger now, the walls sealed, the windows reinforced. It was a scarred place, but it was their place. Inside, Eliza stitched a quilt, the colors as bright and defiant as a prairie fire. She filled empty shotgun shells with dried herbs she gathered from the hills. her own small, fragrant monuments to their victory. They never spoke of marriage. They didn't need a preacher or a piece of paper. What they had was forged in fire and blood and survival. It was stronger than any vow. In time, a child came, a son. He had Matthew's quiet, watchful nature and Eliza's sharp, intelligent eyes. She taught him how to climb the rocks behind the house before he could even speak properly. She taught him how to skin a rabbit and find clean water before he was 5 years old. He grew up knowing the weight of silence, the sound of a lie, and the unshakable strength of the truth. One evening, years later, when he was old enough to ask questions that mattered, he looked up at her from the porch step. "Mama," he asked, "why don't we have family, like the folks in town?" Eliza smiled, a faint, rare thing. She looked out at the land, her land. "Because I earned the right to choose my family," she said, "and I chose your father." She reached out and touched her son's cheek. He listened when no one else in the world would, and that saved me more than any bullet ever could. Sometimes at night, Eliza would dream of the boarding house, of the smell of sickness and decay, of Mert's rattling cough, of bruises that blossomed on her skin like dark, ugly flowers. But the dreams no longer had any power over her. They were just echoes from another life, a life that belonged to someone else. She had built something here, in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just a home. It was a legacy, built from grit and scarred love and the stubborn, unbreakable will to stand up when the world tried to knock you down. She was no one's property. She wasn't a mail-order bride anymore. She was Eliza Granger. She was a storm that had finally learned how to be still. And the land, this hard, unforgiving, beautiful land, had made her its own. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next.